Good afternoon, brothers and sisters. Welcome to Tattooed and Mormon. I'm your host, Byron Diamond, and I'm grateful that you decided to come back and hear another one of the videos that we have. This particular video is I guess it'd be the third part to all the videos that I have posted thus far. And this one's gonna kind of go over my life from about where we left off on the last one, from about 13 years old until I'm in my, probably right around my late 20s to 30s, somewhere right around in there is where we'll leave off. This might be one of the longer videos. But the last video in this series, I wanted to be what brought me back to the gospel and where I'm at in the gospel and all the rad things that have happened since then. So let's get started. So 13 years old is, in my recollection, about when my dad got out of prison. And he gathered up the family that was young enough and that wanted to be able to live back in the home, and got us a house in the same town that we were living in Dana Point. At that particular time, it was myself and my brother and one of my sisters that's right older than me. Everyone else had either moved away or already gotten married. And soon thereafter, my mom and dad ended up dissolving their relationship, and they really, I mean, at that point, they weren't going to church or anything like that. We were just kind of trying to get the family back together as a unit, which, at my age now, I can see how going to church and being involved in the gospel would have helped that situation a lot more than what the situation was helped. Because unfortunately, it was the opposite. The family pretty much dissolved. My mom ended up meeting another man and ended up living on the beach. Now, a lot of people might say, oh, she lived on the beach, that's pretty awesome. Unfortunately, it wasn't that way. I believe they were living in a tent, and I don't know, those conditions just weren't conducive to children or kids, and so I didn't see my mom for quite a long time. My dad was working several different jobs, and we were living, but we weren't going to church and we weren't doing the things that we needed to do. At that particular time, I was really heavy into skateboarding, and all my friends were turning 13, 14, 15, 16 years old, and a lot of them started getting into doing drugs and drinking. At that time, I was lucky and fortunate enough to still have a testimony of the gospel and still know that that was against what we were taught in this church. And so that kept me from doing those things. But that also played a different factor in my life, where my friends also respected me enough and knew that I was LDS. So they weren't asking me to do them, but they also were distancing themselves from me because they didn't want to do those things around me because they knew my faith. Well, at the time, I did take that pretty hard because I felt I was losing friends. But at the same time, my mom started coming around, and she had told me that she was going to be moving to Salt Lake City, Utah. And on her move up here, I decided that I would help them move their belongings up and kind of check it out. And I thought Salt Lake was really pretty, and it was a cool place, but I was from California, and I wasn't going to leave the beach. And so I went back to California for a little bit, and then about 15 years old, I was struggling in life and school, and I felt like I was lacking something, and I decided to come up for the summer, and it had to have been 16, and I decided to come up and visit my mom here in Utah. Well, I ended up meeting a couple of really nice guys and got some good friendships going, and decided that I would try my hand at the school up in Utah. Also, pretty close to around that same time, I was getting really back into going to church. My mom had decided to my mom decided to go back to church. And we'd really lucked out. In the place that we were staying, the ward house was literally 20, 30 feet from our front door, so it made it quite convenient to go. But I was super excited to be able to get back into the gospel. And I was ordained a priest and was then put into the first counselor position within the priest group. I was getting up and blessing the sacrament every week. I was really super involved in the gospel. I was also talking about and preparing to go on my LDS mission. Well, at that particular time in my life, I definitely didn't look like the youth of Salt Lake City at that time. I had more of like a skater look to me. And I had felt that I was being judged for the way I looked. Whether or not that was actually happening, it was something that I was feeling. And so I started to really think about those things and ponder on those things and how I felt I was being judged. But I kept going to church. About 17 years old, I actually ended up meeting the lady who is now my eternal wife. We started dating for a little while, and I ended up breaking off our relationship because at the time I was also breakdancing quite a bit, and she didn't support my breakdancing, so what was a guy to do at 17 years old but to not be with her? And but then in my next video you'll see how that plays into the whole scenario, which is actually a really cool deal. About 18 years old is when I started to fade away from the gospel. At the time, not only was I personally feeling like I was being judged for my look that I had. Now, keep in mind at the time I didn't have all the tattoos and things like that. But also, now where I'm at in my life, back then if you would have asked me, why are you not going to church? I'd have said, well, because they're judging me. They don't like the way I look, or they don't like that I'm from California or whatever. I would have blamed everything on someone else. But now I look back and I think to myself, I was fading away from the gospel because of the choices that I was making. I was starting to make wrong decisions. I was starting to, not want to go to church. I was starting to really start getting it more into like dating girls and not wanting to go to church, not wanting to do the things that I knew was the right thing to do. I started getting tattooed, which made me feel guilty because I was getting tattooed. I mean, it was like this whole string of things that started happening in my life. Also, I was really super heavy into like mixed martial arts and fighting and things like that, which not in a cage at the time, but like on the street. And just all the things that I was starting to do really made me eternally or inside my body feel guilty about what I was doing because I knew that those weren't the things that I was taught. And every time I do something that was against the gospel or against the church, I would slowly start to fade away more and more and more and more. Now, I always had a testimony of the gospel. I always knew the gospel was true. But I do know that when I was feeling guilty about what I was doing and keep in mind, I did not understand what true repentance was and what the repentance process truly was. I always felt that the repentance process was something to feel bad about, like to be ashamed that you had to go in. I didn't realize that the repentance process is actually the exact opposite. It's a tool that our Father in heaven gives us to be able to return back to his side, because he knew that we would sin. He knew that he sent his only begotten to come down here and sacrifice himself for us. But I guess being young, I never really thought about it. I didn't think about it. And that actually didn't happen until, but even a few years ago. So, besides starting to stray away in my late teens, I ended up having my first son, and then around, I would say probably, well, I had actually, my first son, a couple years later, I had a second son, and probably about 26, 27 years old, I decided that I wanted to go back to church. I really felt that strong desire to be able to go back. And when I went back, at the time that I went back, I had one full sleeve done and some tattoos on the other side of my arm that were visible. And when I went back, I really did feel judged. Like, the judgment that I thought I was feeling, even though people were just welcoming me to the Lord. I mean, someone asked me if I was a convert. That's not a bad thing to be a convert, but at the time I felt like someone was judging me because of the way I looked. I had like this chip on my shoulder. But once again, it's funny how the adversary has ways of working on us that we don't feel comfortable going back to church. We don't feel comfortable with the repentance process. We don't feel comfortable being in our own skin, whether our skin is tattooed or not tattooed. You know, whether we have piercings or we don't, or, you know, whatever your vice was or is, the adversary has a way of making us feel bad about it and that we're not welcome. And once again in my life, I allowed that to happen within my own mind, that, man, you know, this church that I love so much, why do the people have to judge me so heavily? And no one at that time was. It was me. It was me feeling guilty about the sins I had committed. Now, don't get me wrong. There's always going to be people in any group. It doesn't matter if it's the LDS faith. It doesn't matter if it's someone at the school you go to. It doesn't matter if it's someone at the grocery store. It doesn't matter if it's anywhere. People are going to judge you for whatever they want to judge you for. That's their choice. But it's our choice to react in whatever way that we feel we need to react to that. And really, we should feel okay in our own skin, no matter what anyone's saying. And it definitely shouldn't keep us from coming back to church. So I think that's about as far as I'm going to get, as far as my life went up until that point. Like I said, the next video we're going to go over the remaining portion up until where I'm at right now. You might even have the opportunity to meet my lovely wife, and then I'm also will be doing a video on her story, because she has a pretty rad story as well. I did want to leave you with a spiritual thought before I close this video. And I do believe this wholeheartedly, and that is that our Father in heaven speaks to all of us in all different ways. It doesn't matter if it's a small whisper or someone being put in front of our path that we're supposed to help. But listen to that spirit that speaks to you. Don't take it for granted. I read a story of our beloved prophet that just passed away, Thomas S. Monson, and that he was at a meeting where his stake president was speaking to him. And he got a really strong impression halfway through that meeting that he should get up and go to the hospital and visit someone that he had been visiting in the hospital quite often. And he held off because he didn't want to feel rude getting up in the middle of a meeting that the stake president was giving at the time. And I believe at the time President Monson was a bishop. Well, he held off and he held off, and then as soon as the closing prayer happened, he jumped up and he went as fast as he could to the hospital. And as he was walking down that hallway, one of the nurses came up and looked at President Monson and said, are you Brother Monson? And he said, yes, I am. And he said, the gentleman that you're coming to visit has passed away, but before he was, all he did was call out your name. And that really stuck with President Monson. And he made a promise to himself that any time the Spirit spoke to him, that he would not pass up the opportunity to listen. And I bear testimony to you, brothers and sisters, that that is so true. And ever since I was able to start doing that, I've noticed a big change on how much the Spirit will speak to you. Once again, at the end of the video, I start to get emotional. And that's the perfect time to say goodbye. And I'll see you guys next time. And I got to go to church. See you later. Bye.